This video is just a primer for those that have never really used Excel before. So the best thing to do is first to get a little preview of the screen and some of the basic features. You will find once you get familiar with some of the features in Excel, it does not look nearly as intimidating as perhaps when you first look at it. A lot of people are reticent to use Excel because they simply feel like it's a lot of math and I'm not good at math. And I want you to think about Excel in a completely different light. I want you to think of it more as a calculator. You use a calculator to perform calculations for you, and that's essentially what you are using Excel for. So think of Excel as a visual calculator. What you are going to learn more than anything is, how do I communicate with Excel? How do I speak to Excel in its language so it can perform the calculations that I desire? So many of us have used Word before, so Excel is much the same, where we have tabs, and in each tab we have the ribbon, and each ribbon has its own set of functions. So when you click on each tab, you get a totally different set of ribbon functions. So that, like anything else, comes with time. Remember, perfect practice makes perfect. So the only way really to learn Excel is repetition. You have to practice. And of course, we do that by doing many projects. But in getting started, when you look at the ribbon, you will see many familiar things like, oh, I know that. I know that. We saw that in Word. Kind of key off the things that you do know how to use already from Word. So let's look at the screen below the ribbon. We have some other things here. We won't get into here, but this is called the name box. If you wanted to name a row or a column of something, we'll learn how to use that later. This here is a grid, and you will notice that when I click in a cell, you can see it as an address here, B1. If I click way over here, oh, that's J15. So it is always the letter and the number that defines what we call the cell address. And cell addressing becomes very important later on when we do functions. So just so you know, when you click in a cell, it becomes the active cell. So A1 right now is the active cell, and if I wanted to type something in it, all I would have to do is make that the active cell and then start typing. And you will notice when I type in the cell, it also appeared in what we call the formula bar. So if I type in cell B1, now that's the active cell, I can type right into the cell, or I can come up here and I can type in the formula bar and hit the enter key or this checkbox here, either one. If I hit the enter key, there we go. So now that's all it takes to type into one of the cells. So here, if I said my product was, let me just call red, then down here I'm going to say it's going to be blue. Okay. And here I'll say yellow. That's all it takes to type something into a cell. Below here we have what we call a sheet. Excel, every time you open up an Excel file, we call that a workbook. Each workbook has a number of sheets. Each workbook can have as many sheets as you want by just simply pressing the plus sign down here for new sheet. And by clicking on each sheet, that will view that sheet. So let's go back to the first sheet and let's do something very simple, because one of the most simple things that Excel does is it calculates things for you. So let me just put some values in here. Okay, and then let me add another column here. Let's say we own some kind of a store and we want to figure out, well, what is the value here of each of the red, blue, and yellow. So we can do that. We can say, well, if the quantity is 12 and the price is 2, well, it's kind of easy to figure out that that would be $24. So let's create a formula to do that. And this is the nice thing about Excel. If you want to create a calculation of your own, meaning a formula, you can just put in the cell, this cell D2 is going to equal whatever is in cell B2. So I can type B2 multiplied by, and the multiply symbol is the asterisk, C2. And I'm going to click on C2. So you can see here in Excel, D2 is going to be equal to whatever is in cell B2 times whatever is in cell C2. And then by pressing the enter key, you can see the result is $24. That's what I mean by this is a calculation tool. If I change the price there and I'm saying, well, it's not 2, it's $23.72, what happens? Well, that number changes because it's whatever is in B2 times whatever is in C2. And there is our number. Now I can do the same thing for row 3, and I can do the same thing for row 4. And how I can do that is by using something called the fill handle. And the fill handle works basically like this. You see this little square in the bottom right corner of the box here? If I place my cursor over that, it changes to a plus sign, and I left click and I drag it down, let it go. It just copied this formula in the 2 cells I dragged it down to, but it did something very important, and that is called relative positioning. And what that simply means is when I click here in D3, it copied this formula, but it brought it down 1 row because it knew, well, D3, I don't want that to have anything to do with row 2. I wanted that to take 2 cells to the left times 1 cell to the left. That would be B3 times C3. And then the same thing here. B4 times C4. So when you copy a formula, it is not going to copy the formula exactly like a copying machine might. It is going to copy the relative positioning of the cells related to that value. So that's something very important to understand, because later on we are going to do something called absolute value, which is different than relative value. But for a minute, let's just get used to using relative value. So if I added another row here, I said green, I have 55 of them, and the price is $10.05 each. If I went ahead and I just copied this formula, there we go. It copied the relative positioning. It said B5 through C5. Here again, I can change the price and the value will change. That's the beauty of Excel as a calculating tool. Very simply, I was able to calculate these, perhaps even easier than having to punch all those numbers into a calculator. Now, if I wanted to know, well, what's the total here of these four values? Well, we have a lot of built-in what we call functions in Excel. And here is where we can use something called AutoSum. And here is the sum value. So once I place the cursor in D6, you can see now it inserts a formula. And it says, okay, in cell D6, you want this cell to be equal to the sum of everything from D2 through D5. That is what D2 colon D5 means. So it's going to sum everything from D5, from D2, D3, D4, and D5. So when you see a function in Excel, it is the name of the function equals sum, and in parentheses you have what is called your argument, and your argument is simply the parameters. It's saying, okay, sum what? Tell me what sum. And you're telling them in the parentheses D2 through D5. If you didn't want that, you can change it. I could have made that D3 through D5. I could have changed, and now I can change that back to D2 by simply making the 3 into a 2 again, or I can come here and I can just drag this guide. Notice when I dragged that frame, oh, it changed it from D2 to D5. So let's hit the Enter key now and get down to the bottom line. There is our total, the sum of D2 through D5. Now, some other general things you might want is, well, these prices here, I would like that to look different. You have all kinds of number formats here. I can come here and I can change that into what we call currency. And now we'll change that. It'll put the dollar sign right next to the numbers. These values here, I might want to change to accounting. Very similar. But in accounting, it takes the dollar sign and it puts it left justified in the cell. Same idea, just a different display. You might also say, well, I don't want to see cents here. So can you round that? Here are what we call your increased decimals or decreased decimals. So if I decrease the decimals here, it will round that off. So these are all your different numbering options, which you will experiment with in various lessons in practicing in projects. So one other thing I want to go over with you now is we talked about relative positioning, meaning when you create a formula and copy it, it simply follows the positioning, but sometimes you might not want that. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to take this and I am going to quickly copy this to an area here, and I'm going to say I would like to know what my prices might look like if I had a 15% price increase. So if I took a number here, 0.15, and I said I'm going to use that as my price increase factor, what would my price be? So first here I'll say, what would the new price be? Okay, oops. New price. Okay. And in cell D19, I want this to be equal to whatever the price is now. I want to know how much 15% more would be. Now, we can do one of two things. Okay. we can make the factor 1.15 because if we just leave it like that, C19 times 0.5 will be 15%. That's only the portion of the increase. We need to add the price back, and then you will see, oh, okay, so C19 times H8, that's the price increase, plus C again, gives us the new price. So now, if I want to see how much all the other products are going to be, all I have to do now is copy that, right? So I'll use my fill handle, drag it down, and there we go. Okay, wait a minute. That doesn't look right, does it? 36, and it's 15% more. Why is it still the same price? Well, the problem is what you have here is relative positioning. It copied C19 plus H multiplied by H18 plus C19. So when you had relative positioning, that's correct. It took C20, but then it went from H18 down to H19. We didn't want this to move. Yes, we wanted the row to move down, but not this row. So that's when we use something called absolute positioning. And the way to do that is to put a $ in front of the row letter and row number of the cell address that you want to lock or you don't want it to move. So if I put a $ before the H and a $ before 18, well, it won't change this price, and it shouldn't. But now when I copy this, you will notice, wow, okay, now that looks right. $42 is 15% more than $36 because this is an absolute reference. An absolute reference means if I copy anything with this cell address never moves. It is like cement. Another way to do that easily is if you put the cursor before the cell address and you press the F4 key, it will toggle it on or off, okay? So just use the F4 key and you'll see every time you press the F4 key, it will put the $ in for you. So that's just a little shortcut, the F4 key. If you can't remember that, just go ahead and type it in manually. The $ before the letter and the number creates the absolute reference. So that is the difference between a relative cell reference, which copies positioning, and absolute, which locks in one of the cells when needed.